Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to David Galata Book Dreamer. I'm David Galata, author of Stellar Trespassers and Kuroganji's and other books. Just wanted to touch base on a subject that I always find interesting, and that is, what can we learn from building orbital habitats? This is something that, we talk about space stations, okay? And basically an orbital habitat is a space station. However, I think there are some things that separate what I would consider to be a station. For example, Star Trek's Deep Space Nine, and other forms, like in 2001, you had the big double ring space station there. It's a nice one. It's one of my favorites. From orbital habitats, for example, Babylon 5, that's more of an orbital habitat. What's the difference between them, and what can we learn from habitats as opposed to stations? Space stations tend to be seen as utilitarian. They're almost like airports, really. They're large structures. They can even be huge. I've seen versions in science fiction where there are rings around a planet, where traffic comes in to the ring, leaves the planet, enters the ring, and goes out from there. So it's very much a utilitarian kind of a thing. The insides are corridors, depending on what world system you're talking about. They can be just very dull, plain metal walls and whatnot. They can have gravity plating, or they can spin for centrifugal gravity, or they can be large structures that have ecosystems within them. Now, given the choice between the two, I prefer the ones with an ecosystem because I think we as humans have more to learn from that. We talk a lot about terraforming. We talk a lot about, how we want to, rebuild Mars into something that's habitable, or even Venus, which we'd have to move that one. We have to move that world. So what can we learn from the orbital? If we're going to do things like terraforming, we need some practice space. One usually doesn't start off with a huge masterpiece painting without doing some sketches. We have to test ideas out, see what works, what's stable, what's not, before we go on tackling a world. It's like learning to crawl before you walk and learning to walk before you run. We want to hit the ground running. That's not always the best case, because if you do that, you're going to miss certain steps that will produce unintended consequences. Now, when it comes to terraforming, unintended consequences can be huge and can ruin a world. So let's start with orbitals. Orbitals are basically like a big tin can in space. Many times they're depicted as spinning in order to produce what I call in Kuroganji's an apparent gravity. It's centrifugal force that's being used. If you've ever been in an amusement park and been on roundups and things like that, you know what I'm talking about. Picture that on a massive scale, something at least a kilometer wide. That may sound huge, but in the emptiness of space, that's tiny. I mean, it's tiny. Our world is tiny. So let's think big. This is something we need practice with. We're not really good at thinking big. We have to start thinking big when it comes to space structures. It may be more expensive. It may require a lot more labor. It may require a lot of resources, but the lessons learned would be vital. Absolutely vital. And we're talking about things like terraforming Mars. Come on. That's much larger than an orbital could ever be. So let's look at an orbital. Picture something I would consider to be a modest-sized orbital, about 1 kilometer in thickness and stretching, say, 10 kilometers in length. That's a nice size. You have the inside of the outer hull, and that's usually where most science fiction authors and producers imagine the environment to be. We have your rivers, your oceans, your towns, your forests, and an ecological balance has to be maintained within this tin can surrounded by a vacuum. So you have to be careful. You have to be able to produce a viable habitat. We're not yet sure how to do that here, let alone up there. So taking the experiment of the orbital outside of our planet's system may be really, really educational for us in terms of dealing with our environment here. We can practice things that we think, oh, this should work. How many times in history have we said, oh, this should work, and it ended up being a disaster? More times than I care to think about, quite honestly. So let's look at some of the things that an orbital could represent. You now have a home there. You have let's say you've gotten that stable ecology going. You now have homes for the people who live and work in the orbital. They're going to need communities. They're going to need transportation to and from their places of work, if that's even required. Of course, if you're doing maintenance on such a large structure, yeah, you're going to have to be able to travel at high speeds. You really don't want to wait 2 hours as a commute in order to get from one end of the tin can to the next one if there's a breach in the hull. No, you want to get there fast. Or you have to have multiple stations within the orbital that can handle key maintenance issues. You have your lighting issue. Do you want a central light? A lot of these depictions of large structures like generation ships and large ecological orbitals will have something like that. Is it necessary? We don't know. We absolutely do not know because we've never tried it. All we've done is made a couple of very small space stations and call them major triumphs. Excuse me, my phone is going off. So I'm going to shut that down. I like being able to give the feeling of a live feed, even though this isn't live. So yeah, little things like that happen. So we might want a net of lights, maybe providing different forms of lighting for different regions of the orbital. That might be an interesting idea. What if the orbital was layered? Now, this is something that very few science fiction authors talk about. There are some, I believe Heinlein's Orphans of the Sky had this, where the generation ship had multiple layers within it. Very few of them do. A lot of them like the idea of a single hollow tube where everything is on the inside of the hull. I like the idea of putting onion-like layers, and each layer could be a different environment with different temperatures, different plant and animal life, different weather conditions that would all have to be controlled. That might be a very interesting experiment as well. And instead of having to build 8 or 9 of these huge orbitals to experiment with terraforming, we could actually have one that we would then experiment on several different layers and levels and learn much more about tinkering with environments. Right now, every time we tinker with our environment, whether we're trying to fix something or we're just doing what we do, and, we don't really know what we're doing. There may be a tremendous number of unintended consequences, and it doesn't matter how good the intentions are. If you mess up the environment, even if you're trying to save it, you're still destroying it. We need to be clever about this. We need to be smart about this. And that means we need to build things that can serve as experiment boxes that we can then, little labs. They're laboratories. Compared to the Earth, they're much smaller. So we might learn a lot from that. Now, different environments, that's a whole different kettle of fish, as my grandfather used to say. We are uncertain as to whether or not we need deserts next to forests. Do we need Arctic zones to have a tropical zone? We don't know. We actually do not know. We do not know these things for sure. What if you need these multiple environments to interact with one another? We're not sure about that. There's no hard data. There are no facts because we haven't done anything about it. Building orbitals would also give us the opportunity to study what happens to cultures that are placed in these orbitals, because no matter who's going to live in these orbitals, they come from a terrestrial culture. Doesn't matter where the culture is coming from, it is a terrestrial culture. What happens when you put that into a space environment? Does it change? Will we have as many conflicts? It's easy on a planet to throw a rock at someone. You're not worried about where that rock is going if it misses that person. But if you're living in a tin can surrounded by vacuum, yeah, you care about that rock, because if you happen to miss the person and you shatter a viewport, guess what? You're losing all your air and heat in one huge hurricane. This is not good. The danger of causing damage to the orbital by its inhabitants might actually kind of calm things down for us as a species. In order to survive, we would have to become more pacifistic so that we are not damaging and endangering ourselves by damaging and endangering such a delicate environment in such a hostile space. There may be laws, regulations that would be needed on that orbital that are not required here. And I'm not talking things like water rationing or things like that. A lot of that comes from the idea that there's a lack of material in space. And if you watched my asteroid mining video from last week, you'll notice lots of resources. So if you're running low on water, you can always grab some. But there's the other point. How to build one of these orbitals. You would not build it by transporting materials from Earth all the way up the gravity well into orbit. No, that is the worst and most expensive and most dangerous and highly polluting way of doing that. To build a huge orbital, we would have to use the asteroids. We would have to find the materials in space, mine them, smelt them, break them down, build our industries there. In fact, the orbital itself could start off as the industry that is building it. And then we would have an opportunity to build these orbitals without causing so much damage to our own planet. And, we could take care of some of those near-Earth asteroids that, could cause problems in the future. Let's use them up. Let's utilize them and build orbitals so we can learn more about ourselves as a species and how to terraform, how to turn dead worlds into living worlds. I am not as concerned about the natural ecological environment of asteroids or moons or even Mars, because if there's no life on them, there's no ecology there. Now, Europa, that might have some life under the ice, so we need to explore that a little better first. If we do discover life on Mars, then we have a responsibility. But asteroids, they're hunks of rock. They're hunks of rock in the depths of space. They're there just sitting around. They don't have an ecology. They don't have a pristine environment. You have to have living things to have an environment, and there isn't one on an asteroid. So again, asteroid mining becomes vital for making orbitals, and orbitals are probably vital for us if we're going to be serious about terraforming or even helping our planet's climate if we want to. We need to learn more, and the best way to do that is to build an experimental lab in orbit. So I really hope you enjoyed this. I love bringing up all these topics. I could talk about them for hours. Not going to do that to you. uh, I might think about doing some live stuff later on once I have a few more subscribers. So please do subscribe and feel free to leave comments. I do respond to comments and I love hearing from you. Even if you don't have anything nice to say, that's fine. That's fine. My skin is thick enough. Thank you. And if you have something nice to say, that's great. Thank you very much. So I hope you have a wonderful week. I'll see you next time when I'm going to be talking about, let's see what's on my list for this. The importance of daydreaming is the next topic. All right, looking forward to that one. Take care, everyone, and have a great January.